Welcome back to Cornerstone Cosplay. My name is Chris, and today we are going to start working on Hiccup's gloves and bracer. Now, I'm going to break this up into a few different parts because there's going to be a lot to cover, because each of these pose their own difficulties, we'll say, that are individually going to be tackled as we go through them. From there, I'm also going to work a little bit more into how a sewing machine with some leather can work and what options you have going that route versus doing a lot of stuff through hand stitching. So, let's get started. Alright everyone, so we're going to get started with doing a little bit of the pattern making. Now, if you would like to check out a little bit more about specifically making a pattern from scratch, you can check out the video right here. But for now, we're going to cover just a little bit on how I created the pattern for the gloves. As you can see right here. Now, the way I got that started is I started off with kind of a stereotypical latex glove. This one's a little overdone, it's a little bit big. It's less about the glove itself as far as when you actually wrap it in tape to set up your pattern. Now, as always, I like to either use like a painter's tape or a duct tape. In this case, I'm going to be using a painter's tape because I want to be able to flex my hand a little bit more inside of the pattern. Now, I'm going to warn you, this does get a little bit uncomfortable, but it is all worth it to get a really well-designed pattern. And as I mentioned before, when you are wrapping this, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be super clean. This is all just putting a layer of tape around this to allow you to be able to build your pattern. Since we're going to be cutting this all up anyways, this shouldn't be a problem. Now, what I do recommend is once you get into these areas, the area across here and in between the fingers, you are going to want to use a nice thin strip going across there, as you can see, and press down here against the muscle or whatever you want to call it inside of the hand, because that's what's going to allow us to get a full, well-formed fitted glove. Now, I wouldn't recommend making this too tight to where it starts cutting off circulation or it's really difficult to move your hand around in, but do go in understanding that you are going to have a little bit less mobility while working with this. So, now that I have this all completed here, what we want to do is we actually want to cut this off. There's a particular way you're going to want to cut this off to create your pattern so it doesn't make a lot more work later. Traditional glove patterns, as I showed, have a section like this. Now, if you notice, there are two sections here. The way you can tell which is the top and which is the bottom is when you're looking at your hand, this line is going a bit farther than the opening that you see here. Right on here from the inside. So those longer lines on here are what go on the top of the hand. So that's how I know that that pattern would be sitting right above my hand there. So right now this is set up as my right-handed pattern. Now this little teardrop shaped hole is where your thumb goes. So thinking of those as we're cutting this off, since this is the top of our hand, this is the bottom, that means this is our index finger. So, by taking this and making that your center, where everything kind of folds out, and your thumb hole, you're going to want to cut from the side of your hand over like this. So the side of your hand over like this, and then you're going to cut this area here as the fronts of your fingers, leaving this as it is. Now, being very careful with a pair of heavy-duty shears, or if you have bandage scissors, that makes this process a little bit easier and safer. I unfortunately don't have any of those currently, but using a pair of shears, we can begin to cut this off. Now, I tend to start by taking the excess off from the rubber glove here, or latex, or Nyltex, or whatever you prefer. So now I just have my hand here. Now the other thing you want to pay attention to is there is one other portion to these patterns that you need to consider. With this pattern, there is a section in between the fingers. So, what those pattern pieces look like are like this. They're little V-shaped pieces that actually go in between the fingers here. So, knowing that these pattern pieces have to be there, you want to make sure that you're planning that out as you're cutting the pieces off of your hand. So, let's get started with the cutting. Since this edge here is the same as this edge here, I'm going to start cutting against the side of my hand. Now again, you want to be very careful as you're cutting this all out. Take your time. We don't want to make any mistakes here. With this, I'll often peel away the rubber so it's not getting in my way as I'm doing the next couple steps. Make sure all of my fingers stay connected. And since this was the front facing here, we need to start cutting all of the in-betweens on the fingers. So, now, what I then do from here is I'm going to want to add a little bit of stitching distance. So we'll just say we want to add enough for a seam. Now, with this, I'm actually going to do this on a sewing machine, so I am going to stitch all of these edges. Rather than doing it by hand, which will take forever, but it is absolutely possible, I want to leave at least 1/8 of an inch on the edge for my stitching distance. Now, because I'm also going to be working with a medium type thickness leather that's possibly considered a little thicker than what many will normally use for gloves, I'm going to add just a little bit extra seam because I'd rather have them slightly more loose than too tight and unwearable. So I am going to rough out about 1/8 of an inch from this edge, and I'm just going to even out this pattern a little bit. Now what I do is I kind of look at where the farthest points are on each of these, and that's how I kind of what I call normalize my pattern. But the reason why this cuts in a little bit is just because of a mistaken cut that I was working with. So from there, I'm going to kind of ignore that bad cut and then add a little bit to these edges. Now, one pitfall that I made when I was first working with gloves is that you don't want to extend the ends here too much farther, or else it may go into different areas of the pattern that you don't really need. So that makes the fingers end up becoming a lot longer and taller than what you intend them to be. So just go about that 1/8 of an inch, and if you realize that you want to add a little bit more for your seam, keep that end point the same, but then just extend it a little bit wider like this in between here. So I will do that for all of these pattern pieces. So in the end, after doing all of this, I then left myself with these patterns. Now what I did was I marked on the one side, whether it's the right hand or left hand, because I'm just gonna mirror it for both sides. So as soon as I flip it over, I have my patterns for the other side. As you can see, I accidentally miswrote them earlier, so make sure you set those up the proper way ahead of time. So once I get all those pieces cut out, shaped, and everything right, I end up with patterns like these. So with these patterns, I just made them for one hand, and then I just reversed it to be able to use it for my other hand. Now, we often have a little bit of a difference between each of our hands, but for my purposes, I wasn't too concerned with one hand being significantly larger than the other. Now, if you know for sure your hands are a little bit more out of character, you might just want to make a pattern for each of your hands individually, but otherwise you should be fine with just reversing your pattern and setting it up as a mirror for the other one. And in this case, I did it for this side and marked it appropriately, and then I switched everything over to be marked appropriately here. Now once I have these patterns all laid out, I have my main pattern traced out, which follows the same principle. This is set up for my right hand, but for the sake of example here, we would have our pattern, we would lay this out flat. So you notice this centerpiece here is the same as here. We have all of these, and you want to mark these lines down to this point. Now the reason I drew it like this is so that I could literally make myself a cutout that I could lay over a piece of paper or a piece of leather and trace directly through it. Now these lines here are actually where you're going to physically cut into your leather. That is going to connect all the way across here, but for the sake of it being essentially a stencil, I didn't want all of these fingers to be weak and break down very easily. So I essentially made myself a cardboard cutout because I can only imagine I'm going to need to make more gloves in the future. So I wanted to be able to keep this pattern for a nice form-fitted glove. This is kind of a softer garment grade leather. This particular one was called a Nomad oil tanned leather. It ends up being very, very soft. It's got a good amount of stretch in pretty much all of the directions. I just really like the feel of it, so I want to use that for the gloves and also some other parts of the bodysuit. So then after that, I laid out all of my pieces and cut them out, as you see here. Now, a couple things that I would like to cover when working with the individual pattern pieces. If you are working with a non-industrial sewing machine, you want to make sure that you have your timing right and your tensions right. I have to dial up the tension a little bit more because otherwise it causes it to gather on the one side and then my thread breaks more often. Now, because this particular leather is an oil tan and it's very soft, it's a little bit easier on the machine, but if you decide to use something that's a little bit thicker, a little bit stiffer for your gloves, you may have a little bit more of a concern with a standard home sewing machine. The other thing you want to be concerned with is that the motors on most home fabric sewing machines are not as strong as a true industrial machine. So it means that it has to do a lot more work poking through the leather. When you think of fabric, it's essentially a material with a billion holes pre-punched in it, and the sewing machine is just finding one of those holes and going through it. However, with leather, it actually has to physically cut through, so that means the motor is doing a lot more work. Otherwise, there are a lot of great options out there for fairly inexpensive machines that can get you started into doing some leather. One of my favorites is the Singer 4452 model. It is in their HD line. It's a big gray beast of a machine. It doesn't have a ton of fancy stitches. It's not computerized or anything, but I found that the motor is pretty strong and handles pretty much all the leather stuff I've had to throw at it, until you start getting into the thick, stiff vegetable tan stuff. It's also nice because it comes with a walking foot, and that's what I use for a lot of my stuff. And like I said, you always have the option to hand sew it. It just takes a bit longer, and I'm a bit impatient. So I'm gonna go with the machine route myself. Alright everyone, thanks so much for checking out this build video on the gloves for Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon 3: The Hidden World. I will be back next week working a little bit more on the bracers, including their kind of technical mechanism. Suffice to say, I'll be utilizing some different inner workings that I'll explain a little bit more later. Thanks so much for checking out the video, and I'll see you next week.